the one part of the movie that I just had to bust out laughing. So there is the Terminator theme, as Keith mentioned, the doo-doo-doo, doo-doo-doo. But then in the scene where Sarah Connor and Kyle Reese are about to get it on, they do like this piano version of the theme. So it's like they're about to do it. It's like,
it's the soft moment.
Arnold Schwarzenegger has had one of the most fascinating lives. From a bodybuilder to movie star and eventually becoming the governor of California, he starred in The Terminator, which came out in 1984. That marked the beginning of a series of films based on the past, present, and future of humanity. And although most people agree that T2 Judgment Day is one of the best movies of all time, how well does the original movie hold up? Let's talk about that right now in another exciting episode of A Cast of the Past in 2020. Happy New Year, folks. We are going to be going back to 1984 in 2020, and 2020 is just, we're getting there. We're getting there, and there are some references in this movie that let us know we are technically living in the future, but you can't expect a new episode every Sunday talking about our favorite games and movies from the past with yours truly, Juan Velas from Puerto Rico, joining me, 2020's hottest man in the universe. We have Ryan McNulty. Wow. Ryan, when did you first watch this movie, considering we weren't even alive when it first came out?
So the Terminator movies, as a kid, I probably saw in bits and pieces, but the first time I actually remember watching it all the way through was probably about 10 years ago, maybe 12 years ago, and I probably haven't really seen it since. I would say probably sometime in the early 2000s.
And now we have from London, Ontario, we have the hottest man in Canada, or the most legal man in Canada. This is Keith Hamilton. Keith, in your case...
that was weird.
When did you first watch it?
When I was a kid, I watched T2 a lot. Probably one of my favorite movies growing up. But I never watched the original until a lot later. I think, like Ryan, it was about 10 years ago, and I think I've only seen it once in my lifetime, just because of how drastic the difference between T1 and T2 is. So it was really fun to go back and watch it this time.
Yeah, I think that most people maybe thought that this movie came out in the late 80s, early 90s, because when you think about T2, which was an early 90s film, it's like, oh, those came out back to back, but it was almost an entire decade before we eventually got a sequel from this. And look, we talk about, with video games, people say 2001, 1997, those are peak years for games. Looking at the list of movies that came out in 1984, holy crap. Some of them was not just great movies of all time from the critical standpoint, but even in a pop culture sense. Ryan, could you quickly gloss over this casual list of movies?
Yeah, so some movies from 1984, we had Gremlins, the first Ghostbusters movie, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, The Karate Kid, Beverly Hills Cop, Police Academy, and Footloose. All classics that are definitely
those
rewatched
are just small
a lot.
movies. You never hear about those these days.
Every single one of those is probably, on TV multiple times a year on whatever channel. You see them all the time.
Basically, if you're checking out a rerun, odds are it's a movie that recently came out around that time. Now, when you think about Terminator, this is Arnold Schwarzenegger. As I mentioned, he first started as a bodybuilder, and it's not the first time, right, that we have somebody that made a transition from, you look at John Cena, you look at Hulk Hogan and the wrestling side of things, they made a transition to movies. Did you have any other exposure to Mr. Arnie there before, Terminator? Did you have any idea of who he was?
This is probably what I remember him from growing up, but he was in a bunch of other movies. But I think when I first heard of Arnold, it was related to the Terminator. But I have to think about some of his other movies, because obviously I remember things like Jingle All the Way, one of my favorite stupid Christmas movies.
So
it's
good.
Bad, but it's amazing. It's bad, but it is amazing. I think this is the first one I recognized him from, though.
I'm trying to think as well, but Terminator might be the first series that I was exposed to Arnold in, because I love a bunch of his other stuff.
You definitely get exposed to him. That's for sure.
They don't no waste any time showing that Arnold booty.
Showing his Schwarzenegger.
Okay. So, people, if you like listening to Keith, remember you can leave a 5-star review on your favorite podcast app of choice, whether it be Apple Podcast, Stitcher. We do have a Discord over at acastofthepast.com/Discord where we can talk about this one and many other episodes. And what we're going to be doing is in 2019, we reviewed the Spider-Man trilogy, the Sam Raimi trilogy. But here, there's technically the trilogy. Like people think about like this one, Judgment Day, and Rise of the Machines as the initial bunch. I guess it's kind of like the Star Wars movies, but we did get many other ones since then. So instead of reviewing these every single month,
we sure did.
Yeah, we are going to be going back every couple of months. But rest assured, you are going to be eventually checking us out, reviewing the first movie and all of the other ones. So this is going to be progressively like getting worse and worse, even though I did watch all of them.
By the end of the year, we will have covered every Terminator movie, including Dark Fate. Which,
for better or worse.
For better or for worse.
Yeah, so let's kick it off with just general impressions, because I feel like when you think about T2, people obviously jump into one of the best action films of all time, and I watched it again last year, and honestly, I fully agree. It's a freaking awesome movie. Now, when talking about T1, the theme, the genre, the tone is dramatically different, considering the fact that it came out in 1984. So kick it off with Mr. Hamilton. What you think about T1?
I found it so fascinating for what you mentioned, because you do think of the Terminator franchise as a whole as a very action-based franchise, but Terminator 1 is not an action movie. I would label it more as a horror movie than an action movie, honestly. And that was my favorite part about going back and watching it. Just seeing how tonally different this movie is, and how there is a little bit of over the top action, and some of it is hitting the real strong in the cheese factory, especially some of the flash forwards to the desolate future. But just the pace of it and the horror movie tone of it, I loved it. It's just so different than the rest of the Terminator franchise, and I really would love to know how they got from T1 to T2, just from that tonal change, because of how it's so insane to go back and think about. And it's a fascinating piece of film because of it. And then the movie itself is actually really good. I enjoyed it. It's good, but it's not Terminator good, is I guess what I would say, where it's a great movie, but it's not what you think of when you think of the Terminator franchise, which is funny because I guess it's the first Terminator movie. It's weird how that works.
Right, but it is a huge risk, because when you think about the Matrix trilogy, right, people always say the first one is the best. Here, that's not the case, but you go to the second one, and already they changed the genre. Like from the soundtrack to the acting, the fact that in the second movie, the bad guy is the good guy. Now, I know there's like, hey, it's not technically the same model or whatever the hell, but it's still Arnold Schwarzenegger starring in the movie, except in the first one, he went from killing people, and now in the second one, he's actually the good person, right? So that was like very, very interesting. What did you think about the first one, Mr. McNulty?
I really think it was a good blend of action and horror. As you guys said, it does feel like a more dark movie. In fact, I think probably about 80 to 90% of this movie takes place at night. And it just has that more horror tone. But I do think there's a fair more action than I actually remember there being. There's a lot of those car chases and a lot of just shooting and everything. But yeah, definitely more of a horror aspect of this guy, even though it's not like filled with jump scares or anything, but it's this Terminator. He is chasing down this woman at all costs. He does not give an F. He is just shooting everybody. So it's definitely a little shocking in how ruthless he is, because he literally just shoots anyone. Doesn't care if it's women or whatever, or dogs. He's just killing everything. And it was nice to revisit this one, because it is tonally different than all the other ones, because they just went from sort of this horror action blend that they have in the first one to it's all action from here on out, and it never kind of strays away
deep,
from
we've
that.
Got a semi-truck chase, and let's just go from there, baby.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this movie in many ways is a horror film, as both of you mentioned, because it's a slasher film. Think about the fact that you have this deep, dark character, and he's just out there to kill everybody. Now, usually you go to Crystal Lake and then you're just trying to survive. In this case, they're going back in time because they want to stop Sarah Connor's son from being born and from doing all sorts of things. But then you have another person go from the future, totally not like Dragon Ball Z, which Ryan and I, before we even hit the record button, it's like Dragon Ball Z maybe took a couple of things from Terminator, considering that was 1989 and this is 1984. But the whole movie is about that, right? Is the fight for survival. And I do love the fact that Arnold in the early 80s was very much a sex symbol. I mean, you look at the guy, you can't help but go like, God damn, I wish I could look like that. So they literally start the movie just like buck naked. Hey, this is what you wanted. We're giving that to you right now. And that's actually strategic. But that actually worked because think about the contrast, right? Like, I guarantee you movie theaters were like laughing, right? It's like, oh, look at that. But then he immediately goes to like murdering people and then looking for different Sarah Connor's. How do you Sarah Connors?
I think it'd be
looking
Sarah
for Sarah
Connors.
Connors.
Yeah, Sarah Connors. Multiple of them. So it's like, holy crap, this movie took a dark turn that I guarantee you most people did not think it would be like that. So, Ryan...
Also, it made me wonder, like, whose great idea was it to put someone's address in the phone book? In 2020, I feel like we can say that was probably a bad idea.
Yeah.
I don't know. A lot of people post that stuff online now, and it's just like, okay, not only are you giving it to people locally, but all over the world.
Yeah, now people know what you're eating, Keith.
Yeah, that was one thing I was discussing yesterday with my girlfriend while we were watching this, was that this is, it's a funny because this movie, an integral plot piece of this movie is a phone book.
Pretty much.
That is a key aspect. That would not happen today. I mean, people just go online, but it's just funny to see.
The Terminator would just hook himself up to Facebook and see all the related searches.
He's this robot from the future, but he needs a phone book. But
Instagram says she has checked in at this restaurant.
Yeah, the modern day Terminator would be funny. But they did actually explain that away by saying a lot of the records from the past were missing. So that explains why he doesn't know exactly where she is. He just has like a vague idea.
So Ryan, in your case, did you like the fact that this is definitely a horror film? The three of us have talked about that. Now that you embrace that, right? We've reviewed other horror films in the podcast in the past. As a film of that genre, which it pretty much is, we know that changed. Did you think it was a good movie? Or what was like your biggest takeaway, whether it be the horror, the story, or the action?
For me, the biggest takeaway always is just how well, like, it's just executed in a really strong way. Like, I don't think if you look at it as just a horror movie, I don't think it succeeds overwhelmingly as like, oh, this is a scary movie to watch. Like I said, I think it succeeds well as this hybrid of action horror. Like, it is, it's very intimidating to be chased by the Terminator, and that aspect of it's scary, but it's not like, oh, I'm afraid I can't watch what's happening next type of scary. But I think it just succeeds as, Arnold just plays the role amazingly of like, you don't need to they figured out how to use Arnold in a great way, because I believe like the Conan movies, the Conan the Barbarians came out before this, but this is how you used Arnold, where it's, he just needs to say a couple lines and just look intimidating as hell, and it works amazingly. And if you don't have Arnold in this movie, it just doesn't work the same way. But I also just love the plot, that it's just super fascinating to me of this. You have to go back and, the machine's going back in time because they're trying to stop John Connor from being born because he's the savior of the future. And Kyle Reese is coming back to protect her. But
and
he
make
also,
John Connor.
But then you get some timey-wimey craziness of he is the father. So it really leaves you thinking a lot about this. And they give you just enough of the future to make it like fascinating, but they don't give you too much. So I think they just leave a lot. It really leaves you thinking in the end, and that's what I really like about this movie.
Something I wanted to bring up, which I completely forgot, as you mentioned, Ryan, they actually do a lot of flashbacks to the future or
They
future
do more
back.
than I thought.
Flash
More
future.
than I remembered.
Yeah.
And that was
Definitely
the
more
part of
than
the
I remember.
movie I hated. I thought that it was just like a bad breakup of pace every time they went to those. I guess it would be a flash forward to the future. And that's where, if we're calling it a hybrid movie between action and horror, that's where a lot of the hybrid comes from. It's like a breakup of pace from the horror part of it into this futuristic action movie where there's robot tanks and robot helicopters coming and just vaporizing people as they go by. I thought it was just like a poor breakup, like I mentioned, because you have this one machine that's this killer Arnold, and then you're going into these weird dream sequences of Kyle's going back to the future, and it just took away from this constant threat of this like killing machine that Arnold was portrayed as, to go into this very, I know it's 1984, so the effects weren't the best, but a very like campy, cheesy looking apocalyptic future. And I thought it took away a lot from the movie, and that's where the action part of it comes for the most part, and maybe that's why I want to like call it more of a horror movie, because the good parts of the movie fall more in the horror, in my opinion, where the bad parts land in the action area.
And I think what we're talking about really does let us know why people thought that this movie was so amazing, and maybe why they greenlit a second one. Because when you take the horror elements by themselves, you would think, okay, so the movie starts and it's about killing Sarah Connor, and that's going to be the movie. And in many ways it is, but as it goes on, it becomes more humanizing, and it becomes a lot more about the characters and less about the Terminator. Because the Terminator is like, hey, that's the cool thing. It's a freaking android robot, like whatever it is. He doesn't die. So you think the entire film is going to be, well, how can they get rid of him? And even though it is, they do that harsh tone shift to like Sarah Connor and Kyle Reese, and about the evolution and the history of who Sarah Connor is. And then, of course, he gets jiggy with it, and that eventually becomes the son, which is even weirder. But like halfway in the film, it dramatically shifts to like almost no action. And it's all about the characters. You know, you have these different scenes where Kyle and Sarah are just like sort of hiding in a car, but they're actually like conversing about the future. You know, what does that future look like? Sarah Connor wanting to know a little bit about the future, but not too much that it can interrupt what she's doing now. And I feel like for 1984, for a movie about robots, Terminators, like whatever you want to call them, right? Like not human beings. And even the fact that Kyle Reese actually explains, like, why does he look like a human? You know, why does the Terminator look like a human? He has bad breath. Like, they do an excellent job in like less than 2 hours to explain like a lot of stuff that even other movies with less content cannot do. And I don't know if you guys felt the same about that.
Yeah, they do a good job. Instead of just doing like this big exposition dump, they're able to cleverly explain the pieces along the way. It especially helps when Kyle Reese is, they're taken into the police station. So it's a good excuse of why he has to say all these things, and only organic material can go through the time machine thing, and then saying that the Terminator has an exterior that's organic, so that's how the Terminators are able to be sent back, and all this stuff. So they explain those little pieces along the way in a very clever way, that he's not just sitting there literally dumping information on you. And like you said, I do also appreciate that kind of last third of the movie right before the final action scene is that they do a lot of developing of just Sarah Connor and, her struggle of realizing, she's just someone who's, just a girl who is waiting tables, and she's this big hero, and she doesn't know how she's going to ever live up to that. But then you kind of see by the end of the movie that she kind of finds that strength,
Yeah, so Keith, in your case, what is something about the movie that, look, it's in 1984, and a lot of these movies, and save like the stop motion stuff, because that's the beefy, obvious stuff, right? But there are other things from like the early 90s that, that does not hold up. There's like also like the outfits, there's the music, but what else stood out from you, whether it be for a good, bad, worse, but it is like definitely 80s?
You brought it up, the music, and I don't think it's a negative thing, but just the soundtrack of this movie. There's not a lot of soundtrack, but they do such a good job of setting up the tone of this movie with that little bit of music that they use. And when it's another one of those things that when you go back and think about Terminator as a franchise, how the Terminator theme that you think of doesn't really exist in this movie. It's almost like they took a remix of that theme and then made it into this great theme for the film. And it's so 80s. It's got the very like dun 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 dun.
I don't know. During some of the chase scenes, some of that like muted like synthesizer stuff was a little weird. Like it didn't feel
it
like it
awesome.
fit.
I liked it.
It was the 80s. The 80s was just oozing out of that part, and I loved it.
That one felt a little off to me. Obviously, like the stuff that was more close to what we know now as the Terminator themes and stuff. I liked all that, but some of the synthesizer stuff was just a little. It didn't feel like it fit for me.
I think the whole purpose was to make us uncomfortable, which it did happen, because it's like during the chase scene, somebody's out there to kill somebody, and considering the darker tone, I think it made sense. Now, the one part of the movie that I just had to bust out laughing, so there is the Terminator theme, as Keith mentioned, the doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo. But then in the scene where Sarah Connor and Kyle Reese are about to get it on, they do like this piano version of the theme, so it's like they're about to do it, it's like,
it's the soft moment.
I love
and the
that
hard
so
moment,
much.
if you know what I mean.
So another thing, how did you guys feel? I feel like with T2 did this a lot more, and it became like a pop culture phenomenon. The fact that the Terminator learns. So as the movie progresses, if somebody says something, he sort of starts copying and pasting that. Like the whole "I'll be back," like that is born from this movie. I feel like a lot of people think about T2, so like the origins really are in the first one.
There are so many one-liners in this movie. I was shocked as we were watching it. The whole "come with me if you want to live."
Give them to me.
Yeah, your clothes, give them to me. I'll be back. There's just a lot of this movie has been taken into pop culture just from the one-liners. And I know that they recycled a lot of it in T2, but it was shocking at the time just how much of it originated in this movie.
Yeah, there's a lot of good ones, and it's like you watch this movie if you'd never seen it before, and you now know why "I'll be back" is such an iconic line, because he just tells that guy "I'll be back," and then he just crashes a car through the police station. Oh,
Keith, I actually made an annotation here. 17 minutes into the movie, I started freaking out. So you and me have played the Mass Effect games, and I think you know where I'm going with this. There's one track
the
in this part of it is like, I was like, holy crap, Mass Effect just plagiarized a specific song from this movie.
Oh, yeah. Without a doubt. Just that sweet synthesizer sound.
Yeah, no, I can't do it.
Terminator made it a hot hit, or whatchamacallit, a hot single. Mass Effect made it a hot album.
Wow. So, Ryan, in your case, is there a specific scene or moment that you're like, man, like this is it. This is what's the best part about this movie?
There's a lot of great moments in this movie. I mean, I think I always remember, even, effects aside, I always just think of the final sequence when he comes out of the fire, and the fact that
Can you really put effects aside in that part though? With
but I just love the fact
my language,
that
piss poor motion.
Yeah, I just love that multiple times you think he's dead, he just will not die, and that's what's awesome about it. They just really emphasize how hard they are to kill.
Dragon Ball Z. You think they're done, they become more powerful. You keep going back to this movie, man.
I will say they do that wonderfully, especially in that final scene. But it's to the point where you're just, when they finally kill the Terminator, you're still expecting him to come back. And that last lingering shot of when he's got his
still there. Like,
the hand's still there, could easily choke Sarah Connor. Yeah, is it gonna grab her? Is it gonna go for the throat? But no, it doesn't. It's finally over. They do that very well.
Ryan's 5 this episode. I love it.
I'm so mature.
You are.
So the other thing, and I called back to this at the beginning of the podcast, is, when they have that scene with Kyle and Sarah, they're talking in the car, they're sort of hiding, and he's talking about the future. The first thing she says is like, "Oh, that technology doesn't exist," and then he says, "It does in the future, in 2024."
Oh, so we're like
people.
4 years away from when.
I know the beginning
in the
of the
Terminator
movie.
series. When do the bombs go off?
Is it like 2000?
I'm gonna have to.
Yeah. Look that up. When Skynet goes self-aware or whatever. But I do know. Yeah, the beginning of the movie, it says it's 2029. I'm pretty sure. That very first scene, and it's like, oh boy, we're only 9 years away from that.
Yeah.
Before we got tanks rolling over piles of skulls, and it's just over, man.
I think it's always been that fascination, and I think this is not just about this movie, but with Back to the Future. It's like, what's the future like, right? Ironically, a movie about the future is like speculating, how's all of this going to look? But I really love that. I think that one of my favorite things about the movie really is like how they cater to Arnold's strengths. I think you talked about that, Ryan, where you have an actor that, he's got a thick accent. And when you think about Hollywood, right, like North American movies, usually the protagonist is like a white meat baby face, as they would say in professional wrestling. It's like, it's Ryan. Basically, out of the three of us, you would be the star of a movie, Ryan. I would be probably one of the
very
thugs.
Boring star of a movie.
Yeah, and then I would be
maybe
one of the
we
thugs.
should like run from that guy or something. I don't know.
Yeah, and then Keith, you'd be like the friend that is far too nice, and Ryan keeps taking advantage of you, but you're Canadian, and that you're nice by default.
That's mean of you.
I'm saying you're nice.
No, I mean that's mean of Ryan for taking.
He's an
I don't
asshole,
know. I
right?
think you might get the characters mixed up here.
Yeah,
But I believe it is in 97 that Skynet goes
it's
live.
August 29th, 1997, according to Terminator 2: Judgment Day. Also, maybe I missed this, but was there no mention of Skynet in this movie? It had another name, right? No, it has like another name, didn't it?
No, he mentioned Skynet at the police station.
Oh, okay.
They don't mention it as heavily as T2 because obviously T2 is much more centered around the whole Skynet part, but they do briefly mention it.
So
Gotcha.
another thing we got to talk about, because this is going to lead to the topic that I know Keith can't wait to talk about, is, okay, so usually movies that cost a lot are movies that have a lot of action scenes, a lot of CGI, computer-generated graphics, etc. With this one, it very much was like live action, like you got what you got,
practical
right?
effects.
Yeah, practical effects. And James Cameron, a lot of directors were very passionate about that. So even like going towards the mid to late 90s. So this movie, which came out once again in 1994, had a budget of $6.4 million, and it made 78.3. So needless to say, they made up the budget. And then with T2, which came out in 1991, that one had a much larger budget. Like, holy crap, from 6.4, we went to an estimated $94 to $102 million, more than the entire amount that it made with the previous movie. And it generated $517 million, people.
My God.
Almost $1 billion. They were on the road to that, which means that when you look at the graphics, the effects, and all that, I think it's no surprise that the second movie had a lot of outdoor scenes during the daytime. The first one, they definitely catered to like nighttime because they can get away with a lot of stuff. They can hide some of the things.
Yeah, easier to hide effects if you have like darkness and shadows and things like that.
Yeah, so there were a lot of close-ups, but jumping to the part that I know Keith wants to talk about, he's a Terminator, right? So when his skin is eventually melted off, then we get to see the actual machine. And oh boy, Keith,
well, not
the floor
only
is yours.
before that, we get to where his I don't remember why. I'm brain farting here, but he loses half of his face and his eye, and then we get that just amazing mold of Arnold's face where it looks like he's dead because they didn't get the skin color
You
right.
mean actual robot Arnold?
Yeah, robot Arnold, where they've got that, like, I love, there's a scene, or there's a section in the movie where he's looking in a mirror and he's kind of prepping before he's going out to get Sarah Connor, and he's looking in the mirror in a hotel room, and like one shot he has his glasses on and everything's okay, that's normal Arnold. Then like 2 seconds later you get bad claymation Arnold with the weird eye and the not right skin color, and then they do that, and then a little later in the movie they go into the big action sequence. Arnold gets burned alive and he loses his synthetic skin. Very cool effect that they are able to show off just exactly what the Terminator is, because you're told throughout the entire movie that, hey, he's this machine. He's a literal killing machine from the future coming back, and they get to show the robot version of it. When they show the robot version chasing them, well, it all kind of falls apart. It reminded me a lot of the movie It, where once the
1990 the TV movie It?
Yeah, the TV movie It back in the day, okay. Where whenever they had like a quick scene of Pennywise, it was awesome. That's what you remember of Pennywise the Clown. Nobody remembers or at least they try to forget that end part of the movie where it's the big confrontation with just the bad monster effect on Pennywise. This is what that end sequence of Terminator felt like to me, where it's really cool in a short burst, but once you actually have to put it into motion, that's where the quote-unquote movie magic kind of falls apart. And even though it's this cool sequence of no matter how hard you try, you can't stop this machine, boy did it look cheesy. That whole thing was laughable because of the stop motion, like unrealistic, like movement of it.
Let me say this.
It was bad. It was real freaking bad.
I will take practical effects over bad CGI any day of the week.
Oh, yeah.
Because even does it look bad at times? Is it funny at times? Absolutely. But there's like a charm to it. When you see the claymation robot Arnold thing and he's like stabbing his eye, it still is like, oh, that's still a little bit hard to watch when he just like stabs himself in the eye. But yeah, you can clearly see when it's real Arnold, when it's robot Arnold. But there's a charm to it, and you kind of appreciate the effort that went into it. Whereas if you watch some of the CGI of like, a movie like Lost in Space or something, the one that came out in like the 90s.
Oh yeah.
There's like nothing redeemable about it, but there's definitely like a redeemable charm to bad practical effects. And I mean, they were not at all bad for their time. Obviously, it's like we're looking at this like 30 years later,
Yeah,
so.
and for those who don't know, so this is claymation, stop motion. It depends on which versions movies work on,
or animatronics even.
Or animatronics, yeah. So the whole point is it's literally frame by frame. So the reason that if you haven't looked at this movie, just go to YouTube, the Daily Motion somewhere, and even just like check out this scene at the end.
It's free on YouTube. The movie's free on YouTube. I don't know if you guys knew that. But.
Yeah, there you go. It's not in Puerto Rico because they don't like Puerto Rico,
sorry.
apparently.
I pulled out my copy of that movie.
Yeah, I still have my DVD. It's like what I love about this podcast. Hey, those DVDs that we haven't used in like 10 years, I can actually use them. But it's frame by frame. So they physically move an object. Chicken Run is a really good example of an animated movie that's completely stop motion based. So it's like they literally move something, take a picture, move something, take a picture. So that's why you see it's like running like 15 frames, because it's like 15 frames a second. That means they have to physically move it around that time for 1 second of animation. So imagine how long it would have taken if they wanted to do like this 24 frames per second thing so it look real. Now, the thing that I got to say, Oh,
For
go
that
ahead.
exact reason, that's why it feels so sloppy to me, the exoskeleton part, because they do such a good job throughout the entire movie of making Arnold seem human-like, to the point where after he gets run over by the truck, like, he's injured, he's kind of limping around still when in his human form, but when they get to the exoskeleton, I imagine it's because they didn't have him acting anymore and they had to use this practical effect. It was just so sloppily done. None of the, like, to kind of hone down on it, my biggest problem with it is the fact that they don't make it look human. Everything that you've established throughout this entire movie, you've taken away by making his movements not look human. It's very skittish and very sudden in a way that a human being wouldn't move. So you're working against it for the sloppy effect that you've done, and it took me out of it.
Yeah, I mean, I just feel like we're in our like ivory tower, just like, oh, they could have done this, they could have done that.
Well,
I mean,
no, not really.
we need some perspective.
It's a fair criticism
It's a
of the movie.
$6.4 million budget. It's 1984. Yes,
Which is
does
a
it
lot of
look
money.
cheesy? Yeah, it certainly hasn't aged well, but I don't think I wouldn't say like sloppy is the word. It's just, they had a lot of things working against them at the time. There's only so much you could do. Yes, you could tell when it basically looks like the cameraman is just holding the skeleton when it's like from behind when it's behind the Terminator. It looks like he could have just been like literally walking, holding the skeleton, or when you see its legs, you could like picture somebody just like holding it just moving its legs like it's an action figure or something.
I think the Keith's point, though, is, and you let me know what you think about this, Keith, it breaks the immersion. The entire movie is reliant on Arnold as a Terminator. He will kill you. He is real. And then you're like, oh, man, we've never seen movies with robots that move so fluid. Like, I get it. Like, the actor's real. But the whole movie, like, sells you on that. So when it's time to literally peel off the skin, then you see that. So, like, as somebody with a production background, like, the first thing they taught us in class is like, look, if you don't have the budget to do something, get creative. Something they could have easily done is cut it to a medium shot. Like, they did like this wide shot that when you show the legs, it is going to break the immersion.
Also, we've had 30 years of like lessons to learn from this.
It's true,
you know
but
what I mean?
you also have to keep in mind.
I don't want to go as far as to say like, oh, they're lazy or whatever.
I get that part, but it did break the immersion, and that was the
I wouldn't
payoff.
call it lazy. I would call it sloppy. And I do think you do have to keep in mind a bit, like maybe it is a little ivory tower 30 years later, but at that point in 1984, Return of the Jedi had come out. And if we're talking about practical effects, Star Wars is the gold standard. So they'd had 3 of those movies to look at.
But again,
and at least learn lessons from.
But not the budget.
Not the budget, but if you're talking about lessons learned, you can look at those things that Star Wars did and make these practical effects look human-like, look normal to the eye, and learn from it. And that's why I'm saying it seems like it's such a miss on that section of it.
And I think one of the other reasons that this is important, even though like I completely understand your point, Ryan, when you think about a movie, we're wrestling fans, like all of this stuff, we tend to think about the end. Like it could be a great 2-hour movie, but the last 15 minutes sucked. It could be a great wrestling pay-per-view. But man, the way that it closed off. And here, the entire movie was leading up to that. I think we would have a completely different conversation if, like, halfway during the movie, we got to see him, like, completely skin melted off. Just so it's like, hey, we got it. You get to see it now. It's not great. But then they go right back. And I think there, people would have had a much different reaction. But even then, you have to applaud the movie for taking that shot. And obviously, we know that eventually improved tenfold, right? So it's like, we are nitpicking, but at the same time, the purpose of the show, and this is going to be sort of the next question now, is like, we are talking about this in 2020, right? So people still go back to T2. People still go back to the original Star Wars trilogy and, one of the 20 versions that they've modified throughout time. With T1, do you think it is worth watching in 2020, or do you think that people should just go over to T2 because they kind of know what the story's all about?
I would 100 times out of 100 recommend T2 over this movie, but I would still place this like number 2 in the overall Terminator franchise. I will admit I have not seen all of them, but just from what I've seen, I will. Yes,
Yeah.
we'll go through this together and talk about bad movies. But from the Terminator movies that I would seen, I would rank this number 2 at this time below T2, and I still think that's pretty high praise because T2 is one of the best movies ever. But it's worth a watch, but not over Terminator 2.
Yeah, it just overall, it will enhance T2 if you've seen the first one, because there is key components of Sarah Connor's character that you get insight on. You won't think of her as the badass she is, like, as much unless you have seen the first Terminator. And like Keith said, it's, from my memory, I've seen like 4 of the Terminator movies, and this is absolutely the second best one. So if you want to see 2 good Terminator movies, you start with the original and you watch the second one.
And I agree. I think that this is a must watch just because it's like you get to see the same character, but in 2 completely different ways. Like, think about the fact that Arnold doesn't talk a ton in the first or the second movie. Yeah, he definitely has way more lines in the second one. He is still in the third movie, but he's a serial killer in this first one. He's just a straight up murderer. And even though he's still a Terminator, hypothetically in the second one, he does become more humanized. And it's fascinating to get that contrast, because one thing that I without question think, the director of this movie, he probably wanted to make a sequel, but based on the way that it happened, the tone, the way it concluded,
I mean, is this James Cameron, right?
Yeah, I don't think I don't think they intended to work on a second one, because it came out in 1991. I mean, almost an entire decade later. You look at like in this year, the Friday the 13th movies, like they had their last chapter in this year. So many movies came out with sequels almost immediately afterwards, like at least within a 5-year cycle. But here, almost nothing for a decade. Do you think that they intended to work on a second one, or was this kind of like a one-shot deal?
What did James Cameron do between T1 and T2?
I was going to say, I'm curious if that was an intentional wait, because I'm sure James Cameron had offers on the table because of how much money it made versus how much it cost. But James Cameron has been known to wait on movies if the technology wasn't there. Like, didn't he wait on Avatar? Like, he had the idea or something? Yeah,
like over 15 years before it.
Yeah, and he waited until he felt the technology was there to do what he wanted. So maybe that was what he wanted to do for T2. I don't know the full story, but, he had been known to do that.
And I mean, stupid me, between T1 and T2, he worked on this little movie. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's called Alien.
Oh,
yeah. That is no biggie.
Oh, that would be a good one to do eventually.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, my mind is blown right now. Both of you can see my screen. I just looked up Terminator facts.
Yeah. Oh my God.
I gotta read this out loud.
That's a tough one.
Yeah, I'll take care of this one, people. The studio wanted O.J. Simpson to play the Terminator. I feel like I just need to just give people a couple of seconds to react. I am actually reading this from mentalfloss.com. We're going to need some mental floss after this. Arnold first came to the attention of Cameron after the head of Orion Pictures had met the former Mr. Universe at a party. At that point, Arnold's only legitimate acting experience had been 1992's Conan the Barbarian, and was eager to break into different roles. Originally, he wanted Arnold to play Kyle Reese, which... What? Just, wow. The human fighter sent back in time. Cameron initially didn't like either choice and took a meeting with Schwarzenegger with the intention of picking a fight with him and storming back to the studio demanding a new actor. Instead, the two clicked over Schwarzenegger's vision of the titular villain, which instead caused Cameron to run back to the studio and suggested that he play the Terminator. Think about, like, we talked about the fact that The Matrix, it wasn't initially Keanu Reeves, it was going to be Will Smith. Like, there are all these, like, iconic, incredible movies, and if we went by the first vision, we may not even have seen these movies, but it's like these perfect mistakes that happen that come to the fruition of, like, these incredible things. What do you guys think about, like, O.J. Simpson playing the Terminator. What?
Or even not even going that route. If you had Arnold playing Kyle Reese, this would have been a much different movie. Just because the character of Kyle Reese is really the backbone of the story part of this movie.
He would have had a lot more dialogue and. Arnold's acting has obviously gotten way better as the years have gone on.
I love Arnold Schwarzenegger movies. I don't think he could have pulled off the acting chops that you need to do Kyle Reese.
Yeah, I don't think he was ready for that at the time. Could he do something? I mean, basically in T2, he was the Kyle Reese, if you will, of the movie, and it really worked there. But yeah, at the time... I don't think that would have worked. And Jesus, OJ.
That would have been that wouldn't have held up well.
Yeah,
1984 people. 1984. Think about that when we're talking about OJ.
This is way before he became an actual Terminator. So yeah.
Oh my God.
Yikes.
Ryan, what would you say?
Yeah, he's on Twitter now. Freaking OJ is on Twitter now, for God's sake.
Somebody
Nothing
tweet
is
at
sacred.
him. And what would you say is the legacy, aside from like this OJ effect, what is the legacy of the Terminator for you?
It really is just the launching pad for Arnold Schwarzenegger's explosive Hollywood career. I know Conan came out first, but everyone remembers him as the Terminator first and foremost. And spawning one of the most well-known movie franchises, even if the last 5 movies have all been not so great, or last 4 movies. I don't know how many there are total at this point, but I think there's 6, right? So
I think so.
Yeah, spawning 4 not so great movies.
A bunch of video games as well.
But yeah, lots of video games. I mean, everyone remembers that Terminator arcade game where you had the 2 Uzi guns.
I got a story about that.
Oh, yeah.
So I went, one of my birthday parties was at a timeout at an arcade place, right? My mom did not know that I was deathly afraid of that arcade machine, to the point that whenever I walked in front of the T2 arcade machine, it was kind of like that X Revolution one with Aerosmith, right? With the 2 guns and all that. I would actually crouch down and crawl just so I would not see the screen of that game. I was deathly petrified of it.
Why?
I don't know. It's like a freaking Terminator, man. He could kill me. That was it.
Okay.
Yeah, I got nothing. It's just I was a scary kid, Keith.
You're a scared kid, not a scary kid.
Well, that I
mean, maybe for different reasons, but... Poor little one.
What is your legacy with T1, Keith? What would you say is that?
I agree with Ryan for the most part, where it really was the launching pad for Arnold's successful film career. It really showed that he could be that action movie star. And even though we've gotten one good one pretty much since, and then another okay one from what I've seen, we don't get T2 if this movie wasn't a success. If this movie was a total flop, there would be no way that you would have been able to pitch something like Judgment Day. So this success directly leads to T2, even though, yeah, it's a sequel. That's kind of an obvious answer, but I think a lot of Hollywood action movies have the Terminator to thank, because you can really start it as a web and then everything kind of move out in front of it. Movies like Commando, and even some of the bad ones like Kindergarten Cop, though, even though they're kind of awesome in their own way, those don't
Arnold
exist
get
without
that role without
without the Terminator.
Who is your daddy and what does he do?
Get down to the bar!
Get down!
Well, I'm glad we fit that into this episode.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about Arnold.
We went long enough without doing that.
Yeah.
For me,
I
think that my legacy piece for it is don't be afraid to take risks. Part of the reason that I suspect this movie had a harsh shift in tone is because we got a ton of horror movies in the 80s, people. This is early 80s. Imagine if we got a second one in 1989 or something, but it was still kind of the same tone. It would have been people, we've had our fix, right? So I think that maybe James Cameron saw that, hey, it can't just be about, oh my goodness, I'm scared because it's a thing from the future out to kill me. They made it a fun experience. I think that when you think about popcorn flicks, my first example has always been T2 because it's like you have the action, you have the story, you have the big set pieces with like the chase scenes and all that. And that all came from this movie, which even though it had those things, it did not put them into the spotlight. So I think that this first Terminator movie, it's like, hey, there's a story, there are characters that you care about
in a great way.
Exactly, to the point that when you go to the second one, it's like, oh, I know these people. Like, those two got jiggy with it, then there's the kid, and then there's, like, Arnold. It laid the groundwork to the point that you did not need to go back to the second one and be like, I'm Sarah Connor, I'm the Terminator, I'm, whichever character, like John Connor, etc. So I really do love that, and I'm looking forward to reviewing the other ones, especially, like, up until the third one, because at least for me, I think I saw the second one, the third one, and then I saw the first one, is the way that I think I enjoyed that, because like I could not fight it. I mean, I was a little kid and people just said like, hey, the first one's like nasty and dirty. So I think I have a much fonder memory of the third one. Oh yeah. Than I do the first one. So Keith, you ready to review future Terminator movies, my friend?
I'm excited for the next two, and then we'll see how it goes. Because there is this feeling with the franchise, at least in my head, where you have like the trilogy. You have 1, 2, and 3, and then on the side, there's the rest of them that just kind of happened.
So it's like Star Wars.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, it's actually pretty accurate.
People, it's a joke. It's a joke, okay? People can have opinions about frickin' Star Wars movies.
No, they can't.
No,
they can't.
Yeah, apparently they can't. Like
Somehow, some way, everyone's both right and wrong at the exact same time. I don't understand it.
Ugh. Everybody watching and listening, please let us know what you think about the first Terminator movie, or if you've watched all of the other ones, like which is your favorite, excluding the second one, because I feel like it's the obvious answer, right? It's the one that everybody's going to talk about. Like, what is the main one?
Yeah, this is a curious question. Excluding T2. Does anyone out there in listener land or viewer land believe that any of those other Terminator movies are better than the original? I'm curious to think whether it's Salvation, Rise of the Machine, Genesis, or Dark Fate.
Let's talk in a couple months.
Think that's better than the original?
I might make a case for 3. Let's talk in a couple months.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see.
That's going to be rough. But remember, people, recently we put out a State of the Cast episode, so we are contemplating working on some future stuff on the show, including perhaps some live streams every now and then on YouTube. So you definitely want to make sure you follow us there, you subscribe to the channel. Though, just to be perfectly clear, if we ever do happen to do a live stream of the episode, that means that those are in listener land. If you're subscribed on your favorite podcast app, you still get your episode the way and the day that you usually would. So don't be afraid of like what's going to happen.
Nothing
exactly. It's like Keith is like the comfortable pair of underwear. So it's like, you know how it feels, you know how it is. We're not going to change that for you. We may change the underwear for YouTube if YouTube is even still alive and working, because like we don't know what's happening right now with COPPA and all that stuff. But
don't worry.
That's why it's important to do the 5-star review, people.
I'll keep your private parts safe.
On that note,
Ryan, it's not easy working with Keith, but that's why you love him, right? That's why you love him.
Sure, let's go with that.
That's why you love him on a cast.
To the
pass.